Hi everyone! This week we're going to be looking at some theories by Todorov about the fantastique. And we're also going to be reading The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, which is the primary poem that he wrote for lyrical ballads, which we discussed last week. Please make sure that you've read both of these texts before you begin this lecture. I want us to start out this week by thinking about the sources of pleasure and meaning when we read literary texts. Now, it may be that you are new to literary theory or analysis and you haven't really thought through your motivations when you read a text. And you haven't really considered what an author might be trying to do to and for a reader when they actually write a text. That's part of the analysis that we're going to be looking at beginning this week and extending through the rest of the semester. So some of the questions that I want to just kind of open up and not really answer for you, but just propose to you are the following. Can there be pleasure in ambiguity? And what I mean by that is, does a text have to have an answer? Do we always have to find the meaning of a text or feel like it's closed at the end, satisfying, and that's why it gives us pleasure, is because we have an answer or a meaning or some kind of resolution to it? I also want you to think about if you search for meaning when you read, and how do you actually search for meaning when you read? Do you create meaning for a text based on the mode? Do you actually consider the relationship of the action of the text to your understanding of how reality works? So do you find meaning in texts that are realistic, or do you find meaning in texts that are fantasy? And if so, how are those searches for meaning similar or different? So do we find realistic text to be more meaningful and instructive, and fantasy text to be more pleasurable and providing a mental escape? How does that sense of pleasure directly connect to the mode when delivering the text's meaning? So it's, a lot of philosophy here to start out the week with, but I really want you to be thinking about these things as you start to read these different literary texts this semester, and to begin to be a little more analytic about your own reading strategies, and then also about the way the authors are constructing and composing texts. So let's quickly review Todorov's theories, and then we'll also be talking about them in the context of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So he says again, as a review, you should have read this in the PDF, the fantastic, also defined as the fantastique, is that hesitation experienced by a person who knows only the laws of nature confronting an apparently supernatural event. So what he means by that is that the fantastic or the fantastique is a sense of hesitation and is really in its base form ambiguity. It is a moment before the character or the reader or both makes a choice about what is real in the text. So both fantasy texts and realist texts can use this sort of ambiguity or in-between moment to draw the reader into the story. And it's important to understand that that is an intentional strategy that writers are using, causing some sort of what you may identify as suspense, but is actually connected to mode. What is real and what is not real? What is taking place in reality? What is not? What is in a fantasy world? And that moment of suspense or hesitation, that moment of ambiguity, can provoke the reader to enter this world of literature in a different way than if that moment was not present. What's at stake in that moment is a matter of choice. So you as a reader are going to be making choices almost unconsciously as you're reading this about where the text is going to go and how it's going to end. And those choices that you're making are really distinctly connected to the way that you experience the text and whether it delivers a certain satisfaction and pleasure and a certain meaning, or whether you feel disappointed and frustrated with it. So we're going to kind of return to this question of pleasure and meaning in a moment, but I want to again go over those kind of basic qualities that Todorov has identified in order for the fantastique to be present, because it doesn't happen in every text, but as we'll see this week with the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and then further on as we go into discussion of some of our other texts, there are definitely texts in the 19th century that are doing this work of the fantastique. So those three qualities that he identifies are, number one, the text should introduce the reader to a believable world and then provoke hesitation in the reader about the nature of an event. So I'm going to use the Rime of the Ancient Mariner as our example, since you also read that, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the actual poem in just a moment. So we read the frame of Rime of the Ancient Mariner and recognize a realistic world. The frame is that moment where the mariner appears at a wedding and begins speaking to the wedding guest before his actual story is told. So that frame begins and ends the poem. The middle of the poem is the action where the wedding is not present, that he's telling the story that happened to him in the past. So in the frame, we see a wedding happening. This is a realistic, recognizable world. And then the ancient mariner appears, and his character and his story produce a sense of hesitation in us because his story contains these apparently supernatural experiences that don't really make sense with our understanding of the natural, realistic world that's introduced in the frame. So number two, what Todorov tells us is that hesitation that we feel, a little bit of confusion or surprise or a sense of ambiguity, could also be experienced by a character in the text. And in this case, the wedding guest is that surrogate for us. The wedding guest is expressing throughout the poem disbelief, confusion, a sense of what the reader might actually feel themselves. So in this case, the wedding guest is also fulfilling that quality for the fantastique that Todorov has identified. And then number three, the reader needs to reject an allegorical or poetic reading of the text. So when we interpret Rime of the Ancient Mariner, we're not going to do that in terms of symbolism beyond the world created in the text. What we really want to ask then, in rejecting that allegorical or poetic reading, is did the events happen to the mariner or not? Do we, like the wedding guest, believe him or not? And that's really what puts the fantastique into play in this poem, and we have to decide, are things uncanny or are things marvelous, or do they actually even make a movement out of the fantastique? So the real question is, what are we going to believe, just like the wedding guest in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner? As Todorov says at the story's end, or in this case the poem's end, the reader makes a decision. He opts for one solution or the other and thereby emerges from the fantastic or the fantastique. So essentially what's going to happen here is that you're going to side one way or another. You're going to either be skeptical and say, I don't believe the Ancient Mariner's story, I don't believe this could happen, and I reject that story, and I reject any lessons that could come from it because it's not realistic enough. Or you're going to say, I believe in the marvelous, I believe that this could have happened, how can I apply it to my life? So there's a decision that is being made, and that decision is about belief. So Todorov has identified these two categories that exist on either side of the fantastique. The uncanny, which is that the apparently supernatural can be explained through coincidence or a rational explanation, either the sort of it's all a dream ending where it seems like supernatural things have happened, but we wake up from this dream and it's actually not something that really happened in the real world. Or it seems like mysterious things are happening, but evidence is produced that show it was actually all the workings of someone with a really clever mind who manipulated circumstances, and it was really all human action and nothing fantastic or marvelous. So if we end on that side, then we're in the uncanny. The other side of the spectrum is the marvelous. That's where the apparently supernatural is actually accepted as plausible. For example, you go into a fairy world and yes, unicorns are real, fairies are real. There's no sense where these things are dispelled. It's not a dream. Magic exists, and we're completely in the world of the marvelous or in fantasy. So you can see how these would also be presenting a spectrum to us of realism to ambiguity to fantasy, right? So there's that same spectrum that we've been talking about with those tensions between realism and fantasy, with the fantastique existing in the middle, that moment of hesitation, the moment before the decision, and the moment of belief or unbelief. So now that we have this theoretical context, what we want to do is think about how to interpret a text using it. And we're using the Rime of the Ancient Mariner this week because it provides a good sense of the way that the uncanny and the marvelous can be in tension within the text. So you'll remember from last week that the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is part of the Lyrical Ballads, which appeared in 1798, And it is the first poem, so if you're opening up that text for the first time, Rime of the Ancient Mariner is the first thing that you would read. Even though Wordsworth published his preface and sort of became more associated with being the primary poet of lyrical ballads, Coleridge still had a substantial part to play, and you'll remember that from Biographia Literaria. And so his poem appears in lyrical ballads as the first one. It does have archaic spelling and words in the original version of it, and people found it very difficult to read and to understand, and you might have felt that way as well when you were reading it this week. That's not unusual. It is a difficult text. It's something that is a little bit challenging. So when Lyrical Ballads was revised for publication in 1817, Coleridge decided to update some of the words and some of the spelling to revise it and try to make it a little easier to understand. And he also did something really unusual. He added this gloss into the text, which is those little notations in the margin that are commenting on the poem itself. The gloss was added in order to interpret the action of the poem, but what he did was put it in this fake editor's voice. So it wasn't like Coleridge telling you, hey, here's what I meant by all of these things. Instead, it was this false conceit of an editor who has decided to interpret the poem and is giving certain information to readers while they're reading the poem. So what's happening then is when you get the full text, which has the fantasy portion within the actual original poem, and then you have this editor who is coming along and trying to dispel that fantasy and explain it away, the gloss becomes a type of realism that is positioned against the fantasy, trying to interpret it, and there becomes this really interesting tension within the text between the poem and the gloss. And it really shows the tension between fantasy and realism, because if fantasy is left by itself, it becomes difficult to understand sometimes. And we have to sort of ask these questions of how do we interpret it? What is it supposed to mean? How do we make meaning from these sort of fantastical experiences that the Ancient Mariner has had with no context and no understanding? And so the gloss is positioned as a type of reader that is living in the realistic world and reacting to the fantasy and trying to contain it and control it. And so you have these competing voices that are in Rime of the Ancient Mariner asking for us to have different responses. So before we get to what some of those responses could be, I want us to actually make sure that we're all on the same page about what really happened in the poem. So I've done a couple of slides here that give you the overall plot. So what happens is the Ancient Mariner stops a wedding guest outside of a feast and forces him to listen to his story. So the power that the Ancient Mariner has over the guest is described in these magical terms, that he has this glittering eye, and that the wedding guest describes himself as saying, you know, he can't choose but hear. Basically, he loses his sense of free will and he has to stop and listen to the mariner. So in the course of the mariner's tale, he explains how he and his crew are sailing and they begin to be followed by an albatross, which is supposed to be a good luck omen. But in fact, what happens is the mariner decides to kill the albatross. And this moment of killing the albatross unleashes a chain of events that are sort of cursed and go throughout the rest of the poem. Up until the point really of the mariner killing the albatross, we haven't seen any sort of magic or things that would be considered unusual, other than the mariner's behavior towards the wedding guests, which is a little strange, but possibly still realistic. But once we have the killing of the albatross, really everything kind of unleashes for the mariner. So all this disaster, the ship becomes becalmed, there's a drought, the crew dies, and then suddenly there's a ghost ship where death personified and death in life also personified gamble for the mariner. So eventually what happens is the mariner breaks this curse that has come upon him for killing the albatross when he learns to bless nature. Those water snakes that he sees, and they're kind of eerie and not really that beautiful, but he learns to see nature as being beautiful, and really there's this contrast provided between his arbitrary killing of the albatross and really a disrespect for the natural world, coming in with this sort of seeing the beauty of nature through blessing the snakes. So as this happens, we have this kind of potential rescue cycle come in. His dead sailors become reanimated. The ship sails home, although it does sink in a whirlpool. He himself is saved. but he still seems to have some kind of curse on him. He must compulsively travel now all over and tell his tale. So when he sees someone that he thinks needs to hear it, he stops them as he did the wedding guest, and he begins to tell them this story. And he has to tell them. He's compulsed by this spiritual force, if you will, to tell his tale to whoever his eye falls on that needs to hear it. So this is how the tale ends, is with this kind of open-endedness of, does the wedding guest learn anything? He doesn't go into the feast. He turns away from the wedding and goes off kind of stunned and forlorn. And we don't really know what happens to him or what happens to the mariner after this. So it's left a little bit open-ended. Now, even though the action of the poem is left open-ended, the poem itself does have this kind of concluding moral that Coleridge put in there, trying to contain the actions of the poem and give it a sense of meaning for readers. But its meaning has really been under dispute since publication. Even though this conclusion, this concluding moral is there, most critics agree that it doesn't really do justice to all that happened within the poem. So I have a quote here from David Perkins that really sums up what is happening with reactions to the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Depending on the interpreter, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner expresses, possibly, Coleridge's personal life or psychoanalytic case, his poetic theories, religious beliefs, pantheist metaphysics, biblical hermeneutics, belatedness in literary history, or feelings about Western maritime expansion, about slavery, or about politics generally. The albatross, critics sometimes dub it as nature, Coleridge himself, Sarah Coleridge, a human being, Christ, the divine immanent in nature, and so forth. The world of the poem is providential, existential, morally incoherent, or dreamily irrelevant. So basically, with all that to say, there is no consensus about what this poem can possibly mean. Mainly because we don't see the character himself make a decision, right? So think about Todorov's theories, think about the Fantastique. The wedding guest doesn't decide, Mariner, you're crazy. We don't get to see him make that choice. Or Mariner, I believe you, and I'm going to live my life differently. All we get is the wedding guest is sadder and wiser, but we don't know what he learned or how it applies to his own life, and it's really left open for us. It really exists in this moment of the Fantastique that Todorov describes, where we're really not allowed to see anybody else make a decision, and the author has not made a decision for us, so we're asked to make that decision ourselves. So the question comes down to, how do you, as a reader, feel? Coleridge did have something to say about this experience of reading and what he would like his readers to be like when they read. He describes this as the willing suspension of disbelief. That's a pretty famous phrase that you might have heard of before, that describes the way that when we're reading a text, we should have the ability to enter into the writer's creation, to suspend skepticism and to participate in that fictional world, whether that world is realistic or fantastic. And he's going to compare this in his longer writing, some of which you read last week in Biographia Literaria, but in the longer versions, he also talks about how reading a text can be like watching a play, that you can fully enter what he calls a dramatic illusion, and that in the best production, you can think of watching a movie, you sometimes forget that you're in a theater. You forget that you're watching a film, and you actually have become so involved in the world that you're seeing put on before you that you forget yourself. And instead, you're really imaginatively in that world. For Coleridge, he described it in terms of watching live actors, that you could let yourself go and just live in that world in the theater. And I think that same thing can be true when we're watching a film now. And also, if we're in a really good book, we lose track of time. We forget where we are. We're not conscious of our physical bodies even. We're really suspending any sort of disbelief in the text and letting ourselves imaginatively participate in that. That can only happen, of course, if the author creates a coherent world and if we're willing to trust the author's vision. But this is what Coleridge wanted for us and from us. He wanted us to suspend disbelief and to just live in that world that he was creating. And I think most authors would probably share his feelings with that too. However, what I'm going to ask you to do is something a little different. So you can still, of course, continue to read and suspend disbelief in texts and to enjoy that imaginative participation and that dramatic illusion that Coleridge describes. But we also in this class are going to be putting theory into practice by doing more active reading. So I'm going to be asking you to think a little more closely about how you are reading and how your expectations are developing as you look at particular texts. So rather than suspending disbelief to the point where you're not being analytic at all about what you're reading, I'm going to ask you, particularly for the next 4 weeks, to look at this variety of texts that are coming up that really lie on this continuum that's identified by Todorov. So we have detective fiction coming up, Victorian medievalism, ghost stories, and the turn of the screw, which I'm not going to really categorize for you because I'd rather you give your own reactions to it. I'm really asking, as you read, to consider the strategies the author is using to gain your interests. How are they developing the text's meaning? How are they providing or provoking pleasure? And what kind of truth, if there is any truth, is being delivered to you? So I need you to be thinking about, is truth the primary object of the text? Is pleasure a more primary object? How is pleasure being generated based on the text mode? Again, if it's realistic, where does the pleasure come from? If it's a fantasy text, where is the pleasure coming from there? How does each text portrayal of reality versus fantasy ask you to read differently? So what I would like you to do is just be thinking of these questions and really considering, as you read for the next few weeks, how are these things emerging? And then we'll be talking about them together as a class and responding to each other and really thinking through how Todorov's theories and this, moments of the fantastique that are asking us to make decisions, what do they actually do for us in terms of pleasure and truth? So again, when we end something like Rime of the Ancient Mariner, we don't always necessarily have an answer about what the text is supposed to mean. And that's why I asked you originally if we can find pleasure in ambiguity. Can we actually not know what a text means and not have truth, but still have pleasure in the reading experience because we suspended our disbelief and we just enjoyed it and had that pleasurable world of imagination? So that's not a question that I necessarily can answer for you, but I'm going to put that out there and ask you to really be thinking about it over the next few weeks. Thanks.